Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the third weekend of January 2025. I'm your host, Chris Krug. The Center Square and the Radio Hour are projects of the Franklin News Foundation, a 501c3 independent nonprofit nonpartisan news service. Established in 2019, the Center Square Newswire publishes original taxpayer-centric straight news that focuses on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Center Square Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insights to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist, and bring you the latest in K-12 education news from our Franklin News Foundation's Chalkboard News team. Today, we'll look ahead to Inauguration Day. We'll look at the ongoing fires in Southern California, and we'll discuss the confirmation hearings that took place this week in Washington, D.C. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation is bringing you straight news journalism through the Center Square, reporting on state authorities and publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. By supporting the Center Square, you can track politicians' use of taxpayer money and demand transparency from elected officials. This is how we can equip everyday Americans to hold their government accountable. Become a supporter of Franklin today at franklinnews.org/donate.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With a look ahead to Inauguration Day, it's Dan McCaleb.
Donald Trump will be inaugurated Monday when he will become the 47th president of the United States, after also serving as the nation's 45th president. Trump is expected to sign a number of executive orders on Monday as well. Joining me to discuss this is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, you are credentialed to cover the inauguration live from the West Lawn of the U.S. Capitol. What are you expecting?
Yeah, I'm expecting big crowds, a big Trump speech, him already focusing on his legacy and laying out what he plans to do and his vision for the country. You know, we're seeing an entirely different Trump transition this time around, Dan. In 2016, the nation was still in shock that Trump had even won. Actually, many of Trump's team was in shock that he had won, and we were seeing disorganization, some chaos already in the ranks that became characteristic of his first term in office. And then, you know, of course, inauguration, the first thing that in Trump's office became arguing about crowd sizes, right? And so how big was the inauguration crowd? Was it the biggest ever, or was you remember all that? And I think we're in a different, round two is a lot different. We've seen a much more organized Trump world. We see these confirmation hearings are being expedited. We're already having several simultaneous hearings for his nominees. It's a much more efficient operation. And I think we're seeing a new Trump, Trump who survived an assassination and has sort of done some introspection and also has a better team around him and is laser focused on his agenda.
Let's talk about his agenda in a little bit. We will, of course, be covering the inauguration, all the pomp and circumstance at thecentersquare.com. But just as importantly, maybe even perhaps more importantly, are these executive actions he said he would take on day one. We expect executive orders related to the border and immigration, related to energy. He said that he would impose tariffs, a number of different types of tariffs on both allies and adversaries of the United States. He said he might pardon a number of January 6th protesters who have been jailed. Where do you want to start?
Well, we can start on the border, where he spent a lot of time discussing on the campaign trail. You're right that there's several things. I mean, there is a question to be asked if when Trump says day one, it's that sort of a rhetorical flourish, because many times when he said day one, it was maybe in an interview and they were asking about a certain issue and he said, yeah, I'm going to take care of that on day one. So, you know, just day one, sort of metaphorical, mean week one, we'll see very soon. It doesn't make too much difference, but what matters to his supporters is he gets it done. But, you know, on immigration, for instance, he has pledged right off the bat on day one to launch the largest deportation program in American history. And I don't think there's much doubt that he's going to do that. He's already nominated Tom Homan, border czar, to handle that issue. He seems very focused on it. He's doing big media interviews talking about that issue, about how he would do it. And, you know, there's, millions of illegal immigrants in the U.S. Over 10 million came in just under the Biden administration, right? And then hundreds of thousands of those have criminal records. And so Homan has suggested they're going to start by deporting those with a criminal record. And then they don't seem they're planning to stop there. So I think, first thing is that deportation program, Dan. There's a litany of other things on the border. I mean, he's talked about bringing about Title 42, which was a COVID era program that really shut down the border. He hinted that at day one he would start that. That would be a pretty significant border policy that if it worked and they actually did it, could pretty much stop the border right away. I mean, shut down the border right away.
Remain in Mexico, the policy that requires asylum seekers, those who actually go through the process the right way, apply for asylum to the United States, but they'd have to remain in Mexico until they get their court hearing. He's talked about beginning again construction of the border wall, and likely undoing a number of policies that were enacted under the Biden administration, including these parole programs that allowed hundreds of thousands of asylum seekers into the U.S. than previously allowed. How about energy? Trump is completely the exact opposite of President Joe Biden on energy policy. He's vowed to drill, baby drill. For example, we expecting anything there?
Yeah, I mean, so the energy and economic policies, we definitely have some day one promises from the incoming president. Drill, baby drill is foremost among them. He wants to open up drilling. His cabinet nominees before the Senate this week who are relevant to that, like Doug Burgum, Interior, or Zeldin, who's picked to lead the EPA, both seem amenable to that idea and are going to back him. And Burgum explicitly said that he wants to be a part of energy dominance, which is kind of a Trump phrase. So yeah, they're going to open up the drilling. They're also, Trump, on that same topic, Trump has said on day one that he is going to lift the electric vehicle mandate. And so there's been a pretty controversial Biden era mandate that kind of seemed technical, but had huge implications. It regulated the emissions from car tailpipes, and it seemed technical, but the implication was that basically all Americans would have to over half of Americans would be transitioning to electric vehicles away from gas vehicles within just a few years. And the problem is that a lot of Americans don't want electric vehicles. They're having trouble selling a lot of these electric vehicles that they've invested in. Even some car makers are wanting to move away from electric vehicles now because people want gas vehicles. And by the way, I mean, in many states, the infrastructure does not exist to charge your electric vehicle. I mean, it's just not possible. Maybe in, Silicon Valley or in different, places on the East Coast, there are enough charging stations, but you get out in the middle of the country, there's nowhere to charge your vehicle. So I think, he's going to have some public support on that, but he has clearly said that he's going to, end that electric vehicle forced transition. And also, while we're on the economy, he's talked about his tariffs, Dan, on day one, implementing sweeping tariffs. This is really uncharted territory for a lot of, that has big implications. Trump says it's going to make a lot of money. We really haven't had a tariff war of this scale in America in over 100 years. And so this is going to be uncharted territory, but he said on day one, he's going to get started on this. So far, he has used these tariffs to help negotiate with other countries. For instance, he got the Mexican president to commit to stricter border security by threatening a tariff.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with all things inauguration, all things President Trump's first week in office at thecentersquare.com.
A big thanks to Dan and Casey. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the devastating wildfires in California, it's Eliana Kernodle.
U.S. House Speaker Mike Johnson told reporters this past Monday that he supports adding conditions to any federal aid to California over the Los Angeles wildfires, citing his position that state and local leaders were, quote, derelict in their duty, unquote. Joining me to dig into this is the Center Square's California reporter, Kenneth Schrupp. Kenneth, what are Speaker Johnson's concerns?
Well, Johnson laid out a lot of his concerns in earlier communications that he put out. He did say that there is, quote unquote, feckless leadership in the state, and said that Newsom had blocked water policy that reserves water from the north to be available in times like this, something Newsom refuted, and, quote, failed to manage California's forests effectively. Johnson also said that LA Mayor Karen Bass not only made major cuts to the fire department, but that she, quote, left for Africa, end quote, as a member of a Biden administration delegation to Ghana, despite her advanced warnings about the fires. Bass did go to Ghana for the inauguration of the country's new president. Ghana is a fairly stable democratic country that we do have close ties with. And it does seem like she did receive warning that these would be especially dangerous fires, but decided to leave anyway. During a interview with the LA Times, during her election campaign against Rick Caruso, they did ask her whether she would continue going on a lot of international trips. And she said that she would not be going abroad to the extent that she has. And appears that she has not really held true to that promise, so I understand some concerns there. Johnson's pointing to California's forest management. Yes, the state has about 15 million acres of land that's at high risk for wildfires, and we don't really do very much to contain it, probably because it's very hard to get legal permitting to do so. And in many cases, the cost of getting the permit, even for the government to do a burn, to get a permit from other branches of the government, costs as much as actually going in there and removing all the brush by hand. So we're spending so much of our time and money on permitting that we're getting very little actual brush clearance done.
And why would some form of bailout be necessary here? Because when he says federal aid, to be clear, he's talking about some kind of bailout, not like FEMA aid or something, right?
It's a bit of both. But we'll need... First of all, there does need to be some form of environmental remediation. We have a lot of old houses that were burnt down, probably had asbestos. Remember after the World Trade Center attacks, we had to do a lot of cleanup for a very long time to get a lot of these hazardous materials out of the air and carted to somewhere safe. That's something that's very expensive and going to take a lot of time. FEMA is probably the federal agency that is going to have to oversee that and get it done quickly. Number two, though, is the state's insurance market. The insurance market in California has been governed by something called Prop 103 that was passed in the 80s that requires the state to approve any rate increases. But because they haven't approved insurance rate increases that are commensurate with costs, damage, and risk from poor forest management, all of these insurers don't have any money. The California Fair Plan, which is the insurer of last resort that people are forced onto, they are not allowed to pass the cost of reinsurance on to people. So they don't really have any money to pay people with, other than an assessment on every single Fair Plan customer in the state, which for a fire like the ones that we're seeing all across Southern California, you could see assessments that are in the tens of thousands of dollars for every single citizen who's on that plan. And I don't think that's likely to happen. The state has proposed a $2.5 billion wildfire bailout or rescue plan, but that's not really going to cut it because already estimates are for the $200 billion range for damage from this fire. So $2.5 billion is not going to cut it. It seems like it's going to have to be a federal bailout and disaster response of some kind.
One apparent policy failure is there's a reservoir that was empty. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power maintains something called the Santa Ynez Reservoir. It's a hilltop reservoir that's been empty since early 2024 for repairs to its plastic cover because without a cover, I guess that water wasn't really supposed to be safe and drinkable anymore. It's a 117 million gallon reservoir, so it's quite large. And many are pointing out that because of its high elevation, it could have maintained water pressure for hydrants that lost water pressure during the peak of the fire as it was taking out some of the town below. These are some very, low fire risk homes that weren't even supposed to have been in the fire zone. That people were able to get insurance for, but the hydrants ran dry. So Newsom has ordered an investigation into why this reservoir was empty. He didn't exactly say that the hydrants ran empty because of the reservoir being empty, but he did tie the two together in a letter demanding an investigation into the unavailability of water supplies from the reservoir and the loss of pressure from the hydrants.
What actions, aside from this, is Governor Newsom taking to address, the response, the recovery from these wildfires?
One thing is Newsom is allowing students who are attending schools that burned down to be exempted from residency requirements for public schools. So they will be allowed to go to public schools within LA County of their choice. Of course, there are those who advocate for so-called school choice policies and who wonder why it took a natural disaster for this to become his policy and why it's only for victims of wildfires. As I mentioned before, Newsom is also advancing a $2.5 billion wildfire relief proposal. He's adding that controversially to his special Trump-proofing legislative session that has two bills included in it currently. One would provide $25 million in legal funding for lawsuits against the Trump administration, and another $25 million mostly for deportation defense for anticipated illegal or legal immigrants who the federal government wishes to remove.
Well, Kenneth, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Kenneth. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Back with more on the confirmation hearings this week from Washington, D.C., it's Dan McCaleb.
Confirmation hearings began this week in the U.S. Senate for a number of President-elect Donald Trump's cabinet picks. Secretary of Defense nominee Pete Hegseth, Attorney General nominee Pam Bondi, and others faced tough questioning from Democrats at the U.S. Capitol. Joining me to discuss this today is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, much of the tough questioning is more political theater than anything substantive. How do you think Trump's nominees have held up so far?
I think they've done surprisingly well, actually, Dan. There's been a lot of hullabaloo, a lot of media firestorm around some of his nominees when he first announced them before Christmas. But it seemed that Trump just rode out the storm. I mean, he was pressured to withdraw some of those nominees. You mentioned Hegseth. Hegseth took some fire. He's faced some allegations. The only one who didn't ride out the storm, of course, was Matt Gaetz, the pick to be Attorney General. It just was too strong. And Trump, eventually Gaetz withdrew his own name. Who knows what pressure was behind the scenes to make him do that or not. But that pick didn't survive. But there's this kind of sense in DC, Dan, that if the nominees can get past that initial wave of criticism, then there's a good chance they're going to get nominated. And I think that's really what's happening here. Some of the nominees were pretty solid, and all they had to do was not make a mistake. Doug Burgum for Interior, Lee Zeldin for EPA, who's, kicked off their confirmation hearings this week. They were pretty solid choices, and they just had to not say anything ridiculous. And so I think they have a really good chance of getting confirmed. Then there was the more controversial picks. You mentioned Pam Bondi and Pete Hegseth. They were facing a lot more skepticism from the Senate, and they had to face a lot of tough questions this week in their hearings. But by many accounts, they really knocked it out of the park. They were sharp. They took some very hard questions and answered them well. I mean, I think that if Hegseth or Bondi had done poorly in these hearings, it could have been over for them. But they both performed really well. I mean, and that was, that's not just my analysis. That was kind of a consensus. So, I think that they both have a good chance. And one thing to look at here is apparently Joni Ernst in the Senate has said she will vote for Pete Hegseth, which is huge for him. She was a potential Republican holdout that could have sunk Hegseth's chances. But with her support, I think Pete has a good chance of getting the position.
Yes. So with the Republicans have just the smallest majorities in the U.S. Senate, any defectors could sabotage Trump's nominees. But I agree with you. The Hegseth hearings from this week, he was grilled, not just on, his experience and qualification for the job, on his personal issues from his past issues with alcohol, accused of sexual assault, never charged with the crime, but there were allegations about it. But he stood his ground, I thought. I don't see how any of the folks who went through confirmation hearings this week are not confirmed. I could be wrong. You don't know until the votes happen. And then Pam Bondi, who, as you mentioned, replaced Matt Gaetz as Trump's Attorney General nomination. She was grilled on a number of her policy positions in the past, but she also held up pretty strong. I think Kristi Noem is up today for the Department of Homeland Security, replacing Alejandro Mayorkas, who underwent a controversial 4-year term in the Biden administration because of the ongoing border crisis. Noam's hearing in a Senate committee is today. What do you expect there?
Yeah, I mean, because this is such a big issue, the border for Trump, I think Democrats are going to be pretty aggressive on this one. I think they're going to want to know, some questions we've seen already is if Trump orders you to do something that disobeys the Constitution, will you stand up to him? It's kind of a funny question, but that's one Democrats have liked to throw out there so far. I think they're also going to want to know, like, how are you going to protect children? They're going to ask about family separation policy and basically the detainment or separation of children at the border. Now, Trump gets a lot of blame for this, even though Obama, enacted similar policies, the kids in cages, the whole line surrounding that. So I think she's going to have to do some apologetics for the Trump administration on those policies. But I think, again, if Hegseth and Bondi seem like they're making it through, Noam is doing just fine, I think, unless she, has some big faux pas today. And I think what's interesting, we're just in this new era of nominees and Senate hearings. I think really ever since Brett Kavanaugh, of course, years ago, faced he for the Supreme Court, he faced all those allegations. He seemed possibly like he was, dead in the water. And there was this uprising and this kind of defiance, and it reset the parameters on what it takes to get someone out of a Senate confirmation hearing. Because before Kavanaugh, really it just took some bad media reports and some quote unquote controversy to have your confirmation pulled. But ever since Kavanaugh, it's been a much different battle in the Trump world when they're really pushing for someone. These senators have to have a good reason, especially Republican senators. They face a lot of pressure to confirm these MAGA picks. And, I think that Noam, as long as she doesn't, slip up too much, she's going to be okay.
Among the least contentious hearings from this week, Casey, was that of U.S. Senator Marco Rubio, nominated to be U.S. Secretary of State. He seems like he's got a clear path to be confirmed, not anywhere near as hard of questioning from Democrats in that hearing.
Yeah, I mean, Rubio is well liked in the Senate. He's seen as more moderate than Trump, and he really is an expert on the issues he was chosen to be a part of. I mean, he's been working on foreign policy issues for a long time. He is an expert. He's done a lot on China. And one thing that the Democratic senators wanted to hear from Rubio, and he gave to them, was that he would seek concessions from Russia. There's this fear among Democrats that Trump will be so hurried to end the Russia-Ukraine war that he'll just give Russia whatever it wants. And Rubio, I think, put some of those fears at ease when he said he will seek concessions, that basically telegraphing that Russia is not just going to get the whole farm when this ceasefire is negotiated. Now, how much that's really true and how much Rubio is going to be able to pull that off, of course, no one will know until it happens. But I think that eased a lot of Democrats' concerns, and I agree with you that he seems on track to get the job.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with all things confirmation process at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you to Dan and Casey for that update. That'll do it for the first half of the Center Square Radio Hour. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. Well, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro supported domestic bid for U.S. steel. Is a federal court ruling from Kentucky the end of the Biden administration's changes to Title IX? And how is the cost of credit impacting businesses and consumers? We'll have all that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and U.S. Department of Homeland Security are warning that a copycat terrorist act could occur similar to the New Year's Day New Orleans attack. The agencies urge Americans to remain vigilant. The FBI and DHS say they're concerned about possible copycat or retaliatory attacks due to the persistent appeal of vehicle ramming as a tactic for aspiring violent extremist attackers. They note that previous attackers inspired by foreign terrorist organizations who have conducted vehicle attacks in the United States and abroad have used rented, stolen, and personally owned vehicles. Prices rose again last month, according to newly released federal inflation data. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics on Wednesday released its Consumer Price Index, a key marker of inflation, which jumped 0.4% in December, part of a 2.9% increase over the past year. The higher December costs were partially driven by higher energy costs, including prices of gasoline. Gasoline prices are lower overall in the last year, but are now on the rise. Closing arguments are expected to begin in the corruption trial of longtime former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan and co-defendant Michael McLean. The trial started in early October with jury selection. Prosecutors alleged that ComEd and AT&T Illinois gave out no work or little work jobs and contract work to those loyal to Madigan to get legislation passed that would benefit them in Springfield. 4 ComEd executives and lobbyists were convicted in 2023 in a related trial, and ComEd itself agreed to pay $200 million in fines as part of a deferred prosecution agreement with prosecutors. After closing arguments and jury instructions, jurors will begin deliberations. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is calling a special session of the legislature to pass legislation that would require local governors to enforce potential deportations of undocumented migrants if called for by President-elect Donald Trump. The special session, starting January 27th, will also deal with the state's ballot initiative process, hurricane relief, election integrity, condominium regulation, and many other issues. Trump has pledged to take a number of actions at the beginning of his term, including mass deportations, with violent offenders as the priority. In his final State of the State address to the legislature, Washington Governor Jay Inslee touted the enormous increase in state spending on various programs and services since he took office. He also implored lawmakers to not reduce spending as they write the upcoming biennial budget. The state's 2-year operating budget was roughly $38 billion when Inslee took office in 2013. Since then, the Washington state budget has increased to $75.5 billion and is facing a multi-billion-dollar deficit for the 25-27 biennium, despite record revenue levels. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on the future of U.S. Steel, it's our Eliana Kernodle.
A joint bid for U.S. Steel from 2 domestic rivals has the potential support of Governor Josh Shapiro. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's Pennsylvania editor, Kristen Smith. Kristen, tell us about this potential deal and what the governor's office had to say.
Cleveland Cliffs wants to buy U.S. Steel in partnership with Nucor, which is based in North Carolina. And they want to do this instead of supporting the deal that's currently been blocked by President Biden between U.S. Steel and Nippon, which is based in Japan. And this deal, if went through, would keep U.S. Steel domestically owned and operated, which has been the wish of President Biden and President-elect Trump and the union and a lot of lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. So now that the Nippon and U.S. Steel deal is kind of dead in the water, this proposed acquisition, which hasn't been put on paper yet, so it's still more of a verbal discussion, but this coming in now from a timing perspective makes sense. From Governor Josh Shapiro's perspective, he has not been on the record as to whether or not he supports U.S. Steel and Nippon joining forces. But he did come out after Cleveland Cliffs' announcement that they would be creating a formal offer to say that he could support it because he's heard things from Cleveland Cliffs that were hopeful, such as keeping U.S. Steel's headquarters in Pittsburgh. But he did say that he's not going to officially endorse any deal until he sees it in writing and sees what specific commitments Cleveland Cliffs and Nucor will make if they buy U.S. Steel.
And this isn't the first time Cleveland Cliffs has come up as a potential buyer. Can you get into that?
In July 2023, Cleveland Cliffs offered to buy U.S. Steel for $7.3 billion. U.S. Steel rejected that offer in part because they believed that federal regulators would not approve their merger because of monopoly concerns. They moved forward at that time with a deal with Nippon, and that deal was substantially larger. Nippon was going to pay $14.9 billion for the company, and they had also promised to keep headquarters in Pittsburgh and to keep the company operating very much as it is now, but with more investment in its facilities to be more economically profitable, but also more environmentally sound, and to bring the company back into the forefront of steel production in a way that it hasn't been in decades, really.
There has been an extension for the time frame for undoing the deal between U.S. Steel and Nippon. Why is that?
There were lawsuits filed last week from Nippon and U.S. Steel that alleged that Cleveland Cliffs and the United Steelworkers Union had meddled in the federal regulatory process in order to block the sale so that they could instead steer the deal back into their hands after being rejected in July of 2023. The regulatory process that U.S. Steel is referencing has to do with a federal commission that analyzes international mergers, business mergers, and gives the green light on whether it's a good idea or not. So what is unusual in this situation is that this commission did not offer an opinion one way or the other on the Nippon-U.S. Steel deal, and in fact left it to President Biden, who has been long on the record that he was against this deal. And so him coming out and blocking it in early January made sense. But because of this lawsuit, they decided to, instead of having the companies unwind the deal by the end of January, now they have to unwind by the end of June. And that will give the legal process some time to play out. There's also supporters who are hoping that they can take this time to convince Donald Trump that he should support the buyout between Nippon and U.S. Steel and stop this process in its tracks and let the merger go through. Again, he's been on the record that he doesn't support it, that he would rather make U.S. Steel profitable again through tariff policies, not by an international merger.
Well, Kristen, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Kristen. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Back with more on the latest in legal battles over Title IX. It's Eliana Kernodle.
A federal court in Kentucky last week ruled that the Biden administration's rulemaking expanding Title IX to include gender identity is, quote-unquote, unlawful. Joining me to dig into this is Chalkboard News editor Brennan Clary. Brennan, many cases have been brought against the Title IX rule change. How does this one fit in?
Yeah, so this was one brought by the states of Kentucky, Indiana, Tennessee, West Virginia, and then some other private organizations and individuals. So that is one of many. I'm trying to remember exactly. I don't remember off the top of my head exactly how many, but there was a number of different legal challenges across the U.S. And even before this ruling, there was sort of a piecemeal implementation of the expanded regulation. So I think 26 states and thousands of schools were exempt from the guidelines because of this litigation, and there were holds from the court saying you can't implement this yet while we're talking about it. So this is one of many, but this is a definitive ruling unless the Department of Education were to appeal it, and then it would go to in an appellate court, and then all the way up probably to the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, the Biden administration is out of time, so we have an inauguration coming up, and so I don't think that they can do that. I asked them if there was anything that they're going to plan on doing, and they said they didn't get back to me. And again, we're down to the wire in terms of what the Biden administration has left. So this is a round sort of condemnation of how the Biden administration tried to implement these regulations, because the court said that it overstepped its authority constitutionally and that it would not be allowed to stand. And so we're going back to 2020. So when Trump left office, essentially, we're going back 4 years in terms of the regulatory outlook. And so that is that's where we are in terms of the litigation.
And let's get into the reasoning behind this ruling. What did the court rule?
Yeah, so one of the big things is that it overstepped the Department of Education overstepped its congressionally given boundaries. So specifically from the court documents, Judge Danny Reeves wrote that Congress gave the department authority to issue rules, regulations, and orders to effectuate Title IX's prohibition on sex discrimination consistent with the objectives of the statute. However, the department exceeded that authority in issuing the final rule, and the text of Title IX shows why. And then he gets into it a little bit more that there's nothing in the text or statutory design of Title IX to suggest that discrimination, quote, on the basis of sex means anything other than it has since Title IX's inception. So essentially, they're trying to redefine what the law is saying, and that, as this court and others have explained, expanding the meaning of, quote, on the basis of sex to include, quote, gender identity turned Title IX on its head. So what the judge said is that it actually flips the understanding of the law around, and that while Title IX sought to level the playing field between men and women, it is rife with exceptions that allow males and females to be separated based on the enduring physical differences between the sexes. So there are men and women's sports for a reason, right? That they can't compete. They shouldn't have to compete on the same kinds of teams, or have everything the same. Like there are these opportunities that exist while recognizing that there are differences between the sexes. And he said that the final rule's approach to locker rooms doesn't make sense. So I mean, again, these are kind of like it's around condemnation. A lot of these different regulatory changes that the Biden administration was trying to make. And he called it arbitrary, that the department has offered no rational explanation for the stark inconsistencies that will result if the final rule is allowed to go forward. Another thing too, the final rule is vague and overbroad. As the court explained previously, several other terms used in this regulation are so vague that recipients of Title IX funds have no way of predicting what conduct will violate the law. Like what would it mean to break the new rules? So also the spending clause of the Constitution, that it violates that. It's also arbitrary and capricious, Reeves wrote. Also, he said the reliance on a previous Supreme Court decision called Bostock. He said that was that case was clearly limited to the context of Title VII and did not purport to address what we're talking about in the rule here: bathrooms, locker rooms, or anything else of the kind. So essentially, in conclusion, he said the final rule and corresponding regulations are invalid and must be set aside, and that instead of that, we would simply return to the status quo that existed for more than 50 years prior to its effective date. So that is kind of what he said in the court documents are in saying we're going to strike this down. And
what impact does this ruling have on the various other cases that were brought against this rule change?
Yeah, I think those are going to continue to be litigated until they have a conclusion. So there's other cases, for example, the Southeastern Legal Foundation. There's different. They're litigating one, I think, that's based in Kansas, and so there's these different other ones. And so I think that would those are going to continue and going to have separate decisions from federal judges. But I think that anything it looks like they would probably all maybe track this way because of how many of them have provided injunctions or like these opportunities to hold the enforcement in a lot of these cases, just and for the same reasons about the constitutionality questions and different kinds of the same arguments that were brought up in those cases. So I think that those do have the critics of the regulation and the rewrite. They're looking forward to having, those litigation victories in the coming weeks, maybe months, even too. I also think with the Biden administration becoming the Trump administration, that appeal is very, very unlikely. So I think that we're going to continue to see, different courts weighing in on this. But in terms of the effect, it's hard to say what would happen. Even if one said, no, we're going to side with the Biden administration, that would be a very interesting situation, I think.
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.
Thanks to Eliana and Brendan for that update. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Joining me to discuss the state of business and consumer finance, it's PhD economist Dr. Orphe Divounguy. Hey, Dr. O, we'll talk about credit today, and I guess, maybe business finance, home consumer finance. It's a story that ran in Business Insider. I always kind of sort of squint at some of the work that they do, but it is an enterprise story, and they're taking a look at the number of bankruptcies filed last year, and it is a high number in relationship to previous years. 14-year high on the number of corporate bankruptcies filed in 2024, a total of 694. That's not great. It's the most, they're reporting, haven't validated this, haven't verified this, but they're reporting that is the most that have occurred in any single year since the financial crisis. So what's going on there? Let's start there. I want to talk about consumer credit too, but let's start there with, with corporate and corporate financial responsibility.
Look, the reality is that interest rates have remained high for longer. Interest rates even surprised on the upside after the Fed rate cuts began. And so I think a lot of businesses are feeling the pressure. And so it's not surprising that we're seeing bankruptcies, corporate bankruptcies on the rise.
And I mean, can you, for the benefit of our audience, talk about how important it is for a business to be able to have access to cash and to be able to afford that access to cash?
Yeah, exactly. Raising money. Not a lot of small mom and pop businesses can do that. And so, they rely heavily on debt, and the cost of debt has increased a lot. Right. And now servicing that debt is very expensive. It's very costly and is preventing them from expanding their operations, and potentially for some could cause them to start laying off workers, which is why we know hiring's been really low. So far, layoffs have remained low. But I think this is one of those other statistics that concerns me about where the labor market is headed, right? I don't, despite the gangbuster jobs report we got for December, I am concerned that if the majority of U.S. companies, I shouldn't say majority, although it's true that the majority of publicly traded U.S. companies may not be profitable, that we're going to continue to see slowing in the labor market, and then weakness in the labor market could translate to weakness for consumers who basically, consumers that have basically been relying on income from their earnings to spend, right? We're starting to see, because debt is so expensive, we're starting to see credit card spending decline, right? Consumers are cautiously pulling back on taking on more debt and really relying on their labor market, on their earnings from the labor market to continue to fuel their spending.
So let's talk a little bit about consumer behavior right now, right? I mean, there was a story that came out right after the first of the year. It was Fox Business took the story and ran with it, but it was from the Kobayashi letter. And they are reporting that the U.S. credit card defaults that to $46.1 billion in the first 9 months of 2024, which would be the highest number of that, in that category since 2010, which would put us back into the housing crisis. And that credit card defaults are up about 50%. Year over year. Are you seeing different data points with regard to consumer behavior? Because I'll tell you what, that story is somewhat buried. I had not seen anybody else pick that up. And I'm just trying to make sense. As you and I were talking beforehand, we were talking about consumer credit actually maybe going in the opposite direction and maybe perhaps improving. That people were starting to rein in their spending.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when you look at the Fed reports, quarterly Fed reports, total debt outstanding has increased, right? Continues to increase. But when you look at the debt as a share of income remains very low. And so, sorry, not debt as a share rating, but the debt servicing, remains very low. And so people are still, so in terms of overall debt burdens, households are still in a pretty good place, because their payments are low, especially when you add to that, of course, their mortgage payments, housing, right? Total debt servicing costs are somewhat low relative to before the pandemic, but it's rising. And I think that's where the concern is. I think the latest shows that in the last, I can't remember which report, I sent it to you this week, shows that basically in the past month or so, consumers have kind of pulled back a little bit on taking on more credit card debt, which is good because, if debt levels are already very elevated, a slowdown is necessary. Curbing that growth in total debt is necessary. And so consumers are cautiously pulling back. I think that's good news, but it also means that sustaining the pace of spending, overall spending in the economy. Remember, household consumption making up the largest share of the economy basically means that if consumers pull back on spending substantially, then you could be headed into an economic downturn. So we still this economy relies heavily on the consumer and the state of the consumer. And if the consumer pulls back substantially, we're likely going to start to see some GDP growth stalling and potentially even going into negative territory, right? So very important to keep track of the health of the consumer. And the labor market has been a source of, has basically been the fuel for consumer spending. Of course, on top of debt, but with debt now, with consumers now reining it in a little bit, or at the very least, not taking on additional debt. The labor market is crucial for us to continue to see, the type of, consumer spending activity that we're seeing out there. Remember, latest jobs report, 4.1% unemployment rate. I think that's good news. It means the consumer is still there. Layoffs remain very low, according to the JOLTS report that we got this past week. And as long as layoffs remain low, the consumer will be fine. If layoffs begin to rise, I think that's when we should start to worry.
Appreciate your thoughts as always, Dr. Rowe. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. Center Square Radio Hour is a production of America's Talking Network. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it at americastalking.com. I'm Chris Krug on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation. Thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.